Everyone knows of the old lion, Theodore Roosevelt. Bully, his slogan. The man who carried a big stick, but most don't know his son, Theodore Jr., nor that his son had taken part in D-Day, playing an important role that fateful day on June 6, 1944. Today we regale you with his story, how Theodore Roosevelt Jr. earned his Medal of Honor, and what he experienced upon being in the first wave to land on Utah Beach. I've compiled this using a plethora of eyewitness accounts, bringing them together to construct just what happened on the beaches, and the role Roosevelt played. Hello everyone, I'm Adam Noyce, and welcome to AN Productions, a channel dedicated to military history, film history, and history in general. Today, we are discussing military history. Here I will be your guide, and I now present to you Theodore Roosevelt, the hero of Utah Beach.
The eyes of the world are upon you. The hopes and prayers of liberty-loving people everywhere.
Theodore Ted Roosevelt Jr. had big shoes to fill upon being the son of Theodore Roosevelt Sr. He always wanted to make his father proud, and to live up to the expectations he placed upon himself and most Americans. In World War I, he'd been gassed during the battles of 1918, and earned himself the Distinguished Service Cross. But he'd proven himself a soldier and a good leader. He returned home with these skills when the war ended. There, he'd help establish the American Legion. He was nominated to be the Legion's first national commander, but refused. But it wasn't his successes in World War I that made him famous. It would be his efforts in the next great war that brought him great fame. In North Africa, Roosevelt quickly became known as a general who liked being at the front. Many knew Ted as a man in the trenches. As one GI noted, quote,
General Roosevelt loved soldiers. He was a soldier's general.
He preferred functionality to formality, often considering his men's looks and his own second to their ability to fight. This brought him into direct conflict with General George S. Patton, Patton finding Ted and Ted's men sloppy and too unkempt for the U.S. Army. Patton even threatened to relieve General Roosevelt at one point, but ultimately it was General Omar Bradley who would relieve him for similar beliefs to Patton. Ted was then transferred to Sicily, joining forces in Sardinia. He then partook in the invasion of Italy. There, he worked as a liaison officer for the French Army and General Dwight D. Eisenhower. All throughout this portion of the war, he begged Eisenhower for battlefield command once more. Come February 1944, Ted finally got his wish. He was placed under Major General Tubby Barton's command in the 4th Division of the 7th Corps, his role more ceremonial than of importance. Ted proudly adorned on his uniform a triangle with ivy leaves, which is why his division was nicknamed the Ivy Greens. But most of the Army knew the 4th Division simply as the Fighting Fourth. The 4th Division was part of 7th Corps. 7th Corps was commanded by General J. Lawton Collins, who in turn got his orders from General Omar Bradley, who commanded the U.S. First Army. Their task was codenamed Utah, and they were to seize the western flank of the invasion, break through the German defenses, then capture Cherbourg, which contained a port the Allies could use to make further landings. Thus commenced some of the most rigorous training these American soldiers had ever experienced. Through the terrible weather and countless days of practice, Ted made sure to partake in every moment. It pushed his failing health to the limit, but perhaps through sheer willpower, he suffered through it all. And come June 6, 1944, he felt ready to partake in the Normandy landings. The day prior, Ted also learned that his son Quentin, a captain of the 1st Division, would also partake in the invasion, but on a different beach. His designation was Omaha. Quentin boasted that he'd be taking part of the first wave, something which made Ted enormously proud. General Roosevelt was 56, something not lost to General Barton. As much as he liked Ted, he didn't dare allow the man to partake in the first wave. Should a Roosevelt be killed under Barton's watch, many questioning eyes would fall upon him, no matter the circumstances. This infuriated and deflated Roosevelt, feeling it his duty to be part of the fighting. He petitioned many times, writing in one letter, quote,
"The force and skill with which the first elements hit the beach and proceed may determine the ultimate success of the operation. With troops engaged for the first time, the behavior pattern of all is apt to be set by those first engagements. It is considered that accurate information of the existing situation should be available for each succeeding element as it lands. You should have, when you get to shore, an overall picture in which you can place confidence. I believe I can contribute materially on all of the above by going in with the assault companies. Furthermore, I personally know both officers and men of these advanced units, and believe that it will steady them to know that I am with them."
With this letter, Barton reluctantly granted Ted's request. Like his father with the Rough Riders, Ted would lead his men into the thick of battle once more. Before the invasion, General Bradley had called all his commanders into a briefing. Nearly 1,000 men attended in one massive hangar. Bradley said, quote,
"Gentlemen, this is going to be the greatest show on Earth. You are honored by having the ringside seats."
Someone behind Bradley suddenly exclaimed,
"Ringside hell! We'll be in the arena!"
It was none other than Ted Roosevelt. This caused boisterous laughter to fill the hangar. It indicated to Bradley that not only was morale good, but these men were ready and eager to begin. It was 0100 hours on June 6th when Ted boarded the Barnett, the vessel transporting his men to Utah Beach, and he ensured he'd be amidst his soldiers. They sang songs together, some including Onward Christian Soldiers and Battle Hymn of the Republic. Already he felt the arthritis in his legs screaming for him to slow down, to take a break. But the stubborn son of the lion would never, and he used his now famous cane to support his weight. Something else had been ailing Ted, something he'd kept a secret. Since Sicily, he'd been having terrible chest pains. He feared a heart condition, and decided to keep his ailment to himself, not consulting any doctors, not even his wife. If a soldier commented on his pained expressions or gait, Ted would put on the same smile he'd learned from his father, the sight reassuring all those who'd seen it. Despite these troubles, Ted was determined to be with his men on the first landings at Utah. For this, he'd be the oldest man and only general to hit the beaches on the first wave. H-hour was 0630. All across the massive invasion, featuring the mighty coalition of American, British, French, Canadian, Polish, and many more allied nations, the liberation of Western Europe had begun. For Ted, the Higgins boats began launching, and he'd be right in the front. Things progressed slowly, the troops finding it difficult climbing down the netted ladders amongst the tumultuous Atlantic waves. These waves would also make driving these small Higgins boats difficult, something which would become apparent once the first ramps lowered. Now aboard his own Higgins boat, a soldier saw Ted wearing his life vest, but he hadn't any weapons of note. He asked the old general what gun he had. Roosevelt answered with a smile. Quote,
"I've got my pistol, one ammunition clip with 6 rounds in it, and my walking cane. That's all I expect to need."
When another soldier tried to help him, Ted barked,
"Get the hell out of my way! I can take it as well as any of you!"
earning laughter from his otherwise frightened and seasick troops. About 250 yards from the beach, Ted's boat hit a sandbar. Despite the driver's best efforts, they couldn't dislodge themselves, nor get an inch closer. The front ramp also refused to lower, and a lieutenant beside Roosevelt shouted for his men to move. Together, they all leapt over the sides of their boat and straight into shoulder-deep freezing water. As one sergeant noted, quote,
You couldn't run. You could only kind of push forward.
Some of the men, notably the radio ops, had to abandon much of their equipment, their guns and belts significantly weighing them down amidst enemy fire. But they made the right call in keeping their radios, which would soon be needed. It was quickly discovered that the current had caused many of the Higgins boats to land further south of their intended landing zones. Ted noted this in a letter to his wife. Quote,
"The moment I arrived on the beach, I knew something was wrong. We passed a capsized craft, some men clinging to it, others bobbing in the waves. As we peered over the gunwale, the shore seemed nearer. But veiled as it was in the smoke and dust of the bombardment, it was hard to make it out. Suddenly, the beach appeared before us, a long stretch of sand studded with wire and obstacles."
Several officers began noting that the German defenses seemed less than what they'd expected. Many of the defenses had been destroyed during the initial Allied bombardment, and only a few mortar and machine gun entrenchments were present. Those who practically swam their way to the shore took cover behind a sea wall. Ted made the correct decision in not carrying a heavier weapon, for his pistol is all he had. He unholstered it when he found his footing, and in the opposite hand was his cane. He waved the men forward, seemingly ignorant to incoming fire. Roosevelt wrote, quote,
"We splashed and floundered through some 100 yards of water while German salvos fell. Men dropped, some silent, some screaming. Up the 400 yards of beach we ran. Then we reached a seawall. The Company CO, with whom I was, Major Howard Lees of Company E, a great tower of a man, led his troops splendidly. He with his men started into the dunes to attack the German strongpoints."
Major Tabb, who was nearby Major Lees, as Roosevelt described, noted what he saw. Quote,
Roosevelt was striding along with his walking stick and ignoring the stray small arms fire and fragments of mortar and artillery shells. His calm, business-like demeanor was certainly a staying influence on all who saw him. He also rousted out a lot of laggards from the shelter of the seawall and got them moving forward to join their units.
These laggards were likely men confused and lost, and trying to regain their bearings. Hardly anyone landing where they were supposed to. They were looking for landmarks that simply weren't there. Namely, German artillery began shelling the beach at random. It left most of the GIs on edge, fragments slicing through the men, the explosions mostly maiming instead of killing. The Germans also had a considerable amount of snipers positioned through the dunes overlaying the Utah landing zone. Roosevelt noticed a house by the seawall. According to the photographs he'd studied before the invasion, there shouldn't have been a house there at all. He knew then they'd landed much further away than expected. But how much? He surged forward, crested the dunes, and found a windmill by the house. According to Roosevelt, he did recognize this windmill. This proved to him that they'd landed a mile further south than they wanted. Now he needed to begin coordinating with the other officers to warn them of their predicament. But there was a lot of confusion on the beaches still, and Roosevelt needed to find a radio operator. And fast. The first Shermans began landing now, rolling forward, giving a great deal of reassurance to the men of the first wave. Ted saw this and sought their officer, a man named Captain James Arnold. He began waddling over to him through the mucky sand when a shell fired from a German 88, sending both men off their feet. But they survived, hunkered behind a Hemibolken, one of the many obstacles the Germans had erected to keep landing craft from getting too close. This gave them some reprieve, and Roosevelt gathered multiple lieutenant colonels. They studied a map, trying to ascertain where they'd landed. No easy feat. Behind them came the next wave of Americans, the troops now landing in earnest. With these waves came Colonel James Van Fleet. Van Fleet described what he found. Quote,
There was lots of small arms fire on Utah Beach. One of my sergeants was killed by machine gun fire just as the leading waves touched down.
Together, Van Fleet and Roosevelt brought forward a radio op, and Arnold called into their commanding general. Quote,
I am ashore with General Roosevelt, advancing steadily.
Colonel Van Fleet wanted more information. Ted said, quote,
Van, we're not where we're supposed to be.
They came to the conclusion that they had two options. They could shift their entire landing party over a mile south to adhere to the original objective, or they could continue from here. Together, Van Fleet and Roosevelt decided to proceed from where they were. Ted said, quote,
We'll start the war from right here.
An American legend was born. While other soldiers were separated from their companies, NCOs confused, officers lost, Roosevelt moved up and down the beaches, pistol and cane in hand, waving them forward, pointing them in the right direction, never stopping, never caring that his life was in grave danger both from without and from within. The physical exertion he experienced was tremendous, and his legs screamed for him to stop, his chest in considerable pain. But he never wavered, and wouldn't, thinking of his father. He kept directing his men forward, guiding them onward up and over the beaches. The house Roosevelt had spotted earlier proved to be a blessing in itself. He wrote, quote,
I had to hot-foot it from left to right and back again, setting up various COs straight and changing the task. Stevie, of course, was with me, devoted and competent as always, his Tommy gun ready to defend us if it became necessary. We set up a tiny PC with my radio behind the wall of a house.
General Barton eventually made landfall in one of the final waves. There he met with General Roosevelt. He recalled, quote,
While I was mentally framing orders, Ted Roosevelt came up. He had landed with the first wave, had put my troops across the beach, and had a perfect picture of the entire situation. I loved Ted. When I finally agreed to his landing with the first wave, I felt sure he would be killed. When I had bade him goodbye, I never expected to see him alive. You can imagine then the emotion with which I greeted him when he came out to meet me near Le Grand Dunay. He was bursting with information.
Upon the arrival of reinforcements, Roosevelt stood there waving his cane, directing them on. One eyewitness, Malcolm Williams from the 12th Infantry Regiment, said the general greeted them with a big grin. General Roosevelt reportedly asked them cheekily, quote,
How do you boys like the beach?
With this, the stunned and weakened German defenses began to wane, and by midnight, Colonel Van Fleet radioed to General Barton, quote,
Defense is not stubborn.
It became rapidly clear that where Roosevelt and the first wave had landed was a better place to springboard their efforts than what was planned. The tanks came rolling in, along with thousands upon thousands of U.S. troops who firmly secured their beachhead. 21,000 American soldiers landed on Utah Beach by the end of the day. While the 82nd and the 101st Airborne had suffered great casualties over the previous night, the landing force had 589 casualties, with 197 killed. For the 4th Division, D-Day had gone better than expected. Stephen E. Ambrose then wrote in his journal, quote,
Credit belonged to General Roosevelt and his colonels.
Meanwhile, to the north, at Omaha Beach, Ted's son Quentin was surging forward with the infamous first wave. While resistance on Utah Beach had been considerably light, the first wave on Omaha suffered some of the highest casualty rates of the battle. They dealt with higher than expected tides, many losing their equipment in the current, mines, high ground, narrow passages, and pillboxes. After many long and agonizing days of fighting and slow advances, Ted's 4th Division eventually helped seize Cherbourg. They discovered many bunkers full of vital supplies such as ammunition and food. Ted saw it his men were fed well that night. After the initial invasion, the American sector had been secured. Eisenhower needed someone to help organize local authorities, with the Allied commanders now surging into the region. He chose General Roosevelt. By July 10th, Ted was all but collapsed with fatigue, and a medic needed to give him some sedatives to sleep. When he awoke, Ted wrote to his wife that, quote,
"I was almost as good as new."
But that couldn't be further from the truth. On July 11th, he received word that a captain wanted to speak to him. At first, Roosevelt felt annoyed, only begrudgingly agreeing to see whoever it was. What he didn't expect was seeing his son Quentin standing before him. It was 7:30 p.m. They talked throughout the night, happy they were both alive. Quentin described his father as being, quote,
Fit, healthy, and unscathed. But filthy.
Ted and Quentin together would be a monumentous moment in military history itself. Together, they'd be the only father-son duo to partake in D-Day's first wave at Normandy. All seemed well. But when Captain Quentin Roosevelt returned to 1st Division HQ, he was told the news he least expected. Theodore Roosevelt Jr. had died of a heart attack. Quentin wrote to his mother, quote, "The lion is dead." For his valor on D-Day, Ted was awarded the Medal of Honor. The citation read as follows.
For gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty on the 6th of June 1944 in France. His valor, courage, and presence in the very front of the attack and his complete unconcern at being under heavy fire inspired the troops to heights of enthusiasm and self-sacrifice. Although the enemy had the beach under constant direct fire, Brigadier General Roosevelt moved from one locality to another, rallying men around him, directed and personally led them against the enemy. Under his seasoned, precise, calm, and unfaltering leadership, assault troops reduced beach strong points and rapidly moved inland with minimum casualties.
I hope you all enjoyed this tale of Ted Roosevelt Jr. and his heroism on Utah Beach, as we remember those who lost their lives on D-Day, June 6th, 1944. Thank you very much for watching and listening. If you liked what you saw, we have more history content available on the channel. Links to all of our social media are also available in the description below. Thank you for watching.